whatever the case, Mr. Trump decided to increase tariffs on Canada, for example, which is a shot over the bow at other countries who might be willing to act similarly, and is also an indication of the overriding point that U.S. imperialism is the major stumbling block. Now, fortunately, as a result of this struggle, we see more enlightenment concerning why this might be the case. There's been more talk about settler colonialism in North America, particularly in the United States, in recent months because of the invocation of settler colonialism in historic Palestine. And that is a step forward, politically and historically, with regard to our analysis of the United States of America. And given that positive repercussion, I think that it bodes well for our ability to make progress in terms of this struggle concerning Palestine. I think U.S. imperialism is playing a dangerous game right now in league with their comrades in the Gulf monarchs, because on the one hand, I think what the Gulf monarchs, they tend to do, they tend to export religious extremism and religious zealotry because they feel that takes the heat off of them in their own home, in their own backyard. But at the same time, this religious zealotry can be like a raging fire that spirals out of control and that ultimately can leap the Red Sea back to the Gulf monarch. And ditto for U.S. imperialism, because this religious zealotry is not only beleaguering Sahel states, it's also beleaguering northern Nigeria, Nigeria being the most populous country on the African continent, a major oil producer. It's beleaguering Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire. I was listening to a report the other day about the role of Egypt, al-Sisi's Egypt, which has not necessarily been as progressive concerning the Palestinian question as many of us would have hoped. We also see that the Gulf monarchs, particularly the UAE, they're playing a devastating role in Africa, in particular, not least in the Sudan, where the latest news is that the UAE is now sponsoring Colombian mercenaries. Algeria came to be seen as what the late, great Guinea-Bissau revolutionary leader Amilcar Cabral called the Mecca of revolution. As he said, Catholics flock to the Vatican, Muslims flock to Mecca, and revolutionaries flock to Algeria.
Good morning, everyone, or good day for wherever you are. We are here again with Professor Gerald Horne. I always say he probably does not need any introduction. Professor Horne does a lot of work on so many topics, such as white supremacy, black activism, you name it. And today we would like to talk to you, Professor Horne, about something that I saw you say recently on the Activist News Network, something that I found very interesting as a half Algerian, half Dutch guy, and that is that you said that, and it's something that we in the anti-imperialist sphere are not very much aware of. You said historically, but also today, Algeria is a very important country, and we should be thankful to it. And I was wondering, can you explain us why that is? Why is it such an important country for the anti-imperialist corner of activism, and why both historically and today?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, Algeria, in the northern corner of Africa, played a very instrumental and important role in terms of destabilizing French imperialism and French colonialism in the 1950s, which had tremendous knock-on effects with regard to the noxious French role in Indochina, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, for example. And it also forced contradictions with the United States of America. That is to say, the Algerian struggle compelled sharpened contradictions between Paris and Washington. What I mean is that the then useful Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, before being elected to U.S. president in 1960, thought he could steal a march on French colonialism by criticizing the French role in Algeria, because, as you know, this was a very bloody struggle that was taking place in northern Africa. And as a result, this heightened tensions between Paris and Washington, tensions which had already been exacerbated. Recall in 1956 when you had the piratical attack by Israel, France, and Britain on Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. These powers had to back down, not only because the then Soviet Union objected stridently and strenuously, but also because the United States of America objected. And it's interesting, that led to another important turning point, because Britain drew the conclusion that it should always tie its fate closely to that of Uncle Sam, where France took the opposite conclusion. That is to say that the United States was an unreliable ally. You still hear echoes of that today, and President Macron speaking of strategic autonomy of the European Union, distancing itself from U.S. imperialism. And so I think that it's important to point out as well the solidarity between Nasser's Egypt and the National Liberation Forces in Algeria, which helped to sharpen these contradictions, which eventuated in a monumental victory in 1962 with Algerian independence. Recall that one of the early diplomatic maneuvers of Algiers was to embrace Martin Luther King, that is to say, Ben Bella, the early leader of the revolutionary forces, came to United Nations New York, where he had a very important meeting with Dr. King, which of course raised eyebrows in Washington and on Wall Street. Certainly did not win him many plaudits and favors in the United States of America. And rather quickly, even after Ben Bella exited from the scene, Algeria came to be seen as what the late, great Guinea-Bissau revolutionary leader Amilcar Cabral called the Mecca of revolution. As he said, Catholics flocked to the Vatican, Muslims flocked to Mecca, and revolutionaries flocked to Algeria. And that was not puffery, that was not hyperbole, because a few years after embracing Dr. King in the post-Ben Bella era, you saw that Algiers opened its doors to a diplomatic legation from the Black Panther Party of the United States of America, which again did not win applause in Washington. And as I point out in my book, Armed Struggle, on the opening page, it was in 1971 that the Black Panther Party, with this diplomatic legation in Algiers, had a very important meeting with representatives from then socialist Czechoslovakia, where under the aegis of Algiers, the Czechs and Slovaks decided to provide arms to the Black Panther Party to wage armed struggle in the United States of America, which obviously was outrageous to Washington and to the Nixon administration then in power. And I go into that at some length as to how that ruffled feathers in Washington and on Wall Street. And at the same time, you had the Black Panther Party liaising not only with African revolutionaries, for example, as Cabral had said, Algiers was replete with African revolutionaries, those fighting for independence in the southern cone of the continent, up to and including South Africa, but also Palestinians. And as a result of Palestinians and Black Panthers being tutored and trained in Algiers, they were able to establish a relationship of some moment. And allow me for a moment to take a step back historically before we go further. because it's important to point out that this vexed relationship between Algiers and Washington did not necessarily arise spontaneously in the middle of the 20th century. If you go back to the early 1800s, you will find that Washington had very difficult relations with Algiers because Washington made the claim that so-called pirates in Algiers were kidnapping U.S. sailors. What was happening is U.S. slave ships were sailing south in Africa to kidnap and enslave Africans and bring them back to the United States to work for free. Oftentimes they fell victim to that very same process. And then the folks in Algiers would demand ransoms, tribute, as it was called at the time, which was outraging to Washington, led to Washington bombarding Algiers more than once. And it's possible, I think, to make an argument that when Algeria was colonized by France circa 1830, that a precursor and a prelude to that was the softening up of Algiers by U.S. bombarding, which made the colonizing of the French more likely to occur. Alas, this revolutionary moment that we have just described in Algiers did not necessarily have legs, as they say. It led to complications, particularly with neighboring Morocco. Recall that Morocco comes to independence in 1956, both under the colonial heel of France. But for various reasons, the relationship between these two North African states was and is complicated, to put it euphemistic. And that relationship has been complicated even more by the fact that Morocco, post 1975, seized Western Sahara due south of Morocco because you know that in 1975, Spanish fascism was toppled. Spain was the colonial power in Western Sahara. Algeria took an opposing tack consistent with its history, that is to say, supporting the national liberation aspirations of the Polisario, the sole legitimate authority in Western Sahara. But in recent years, Morocco seems to be on a roll. That is to say, the United States has recognized its illegitimate authority in Western Sahara, as have a number of other North Atlantic powers, including Britain. Not only North Atlantic powers, a number of African states have recognized the illegitimacy of the Moroccan claim to Western Sahara, including Kenya in East Africa. The Sahel states, speaking of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, of course, bordering the south of Algeria, because they are landlocked and needed an outlet to the sea. They too have cut a deal with Morocco. And of course, these Sahel states are under unremitting pressure because of their relationship with Russia and China. And speaking of China, what I would like to see and what your audience should be clamoring for is for China to play a role vis-a-vis Morocco and Algeria that it played vis-a-vis Iran and Saudi Arabia. Recall that it was China that brought together these two states, speaking of Iran and Saudi Arabia, after many had thought that this was well nigh impossible. China has very sound relations with Algeria, and it has sound relations with Morocco. Some might even say that the relationship with Morocco is too sound, in fact. But in any event, it creates a threshold. It creates a predicate for Chinese diplomacy, because I'm very concerned with the fact that Algeria might find itself encircled diplomatically isolated, particularly given the fact that Morocco seemingly has outflanked Algiers on the Western Sahara question. We also know that the Western European powers, particularly Italy and France, are lusting for Algerian energy, particularly natural gas, especially since they cut themselves off from natural gas from Russia as a result of the Ukraine episode. And we also know that post the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which inaugurated a period when erstwhile revolutionary forces were on the defensive, this also inaugurated a period in Algiers when you had the so-called religious zealots on the march, many of whom had fought in Afghanistan, many of whom had been backed by the Gulf monarchs, particularly Saudi Arabia, for example. This led to tremendous destabilization in Algiers, from which the nation was able to recover to the point in 2025 that we can say that the bloody period of the 1990s is now a kind of distant memory. But the fact that it did occur and the fact that the same forces are still in play, speaking of the Gulf monarchs who continue to play a destabilizing role in Africa, something I'm sure we'll be talking about at some length during this particular conversation, not to mention the wily Moroccans who have a bone to pick with Algiers because of the Western Sahara, and not to mention France, because relations.
If I may quickly interrupt, Professor Horne, because I definitely want to go there where we are today. But I do have a question, and I hope maybe you know a bit more about that, about the independence struggle itself in Algeria, because not a lot of people know about that, and I think that is on purpose. I think it's the same as with Haiti, where somehow activists of today don't know a lot about it, because these are one of the few very successful, you could say, anti-colonial battles. Can you tell us a bit more about that struggle itself, how it compares to what we see today in Palestine, for example? Because people don't realize how incredibly brutal also the Algerian independence struggle was, and how many tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in a short time by the French, which is very comparable to what is happening in Palestine today. And is there something maybe that is comparable and that we can maybe learn from it? What are your thoughts on that comparison between Palestine and the Algerian struggle?
Incredibly bloody indeed. I'm not in the habit of recommending cultural artifacts for educational purposes when history, I think, serves a better purpose. But I would recommend the film Battle of Algiers by the Italian director Pontecorvo. And by the way, he also did another film dealing in a fictional sense with the Haitian Revolution, Burn, Burn, with an exclamation point, which I also recommend. But you get an idea of the bloodiness of the liberation struggle in Algeria. And likewise, this had repercussions and ramifications across the Mediterranean, because I would also suggest a novel, The Day of the Jackal, which deals with the fact that Algeria had French settlers. That's one of the differences between the liberation struggle in, for example, Algiers and other parts of Africa, for example, let's say Nigeria, for example, or even the Sahel states. And when you have settlers, inevitably the struggle becomes ever more intense and violent. I'm thinking of the Kenya struggle culminating in 1963 with independence. Recall the so-called Mau Mau where you had the Land and Freedom Army of the Africans, the Kikuyu and the Luo, fighting not only British settlers, but a goodly number of Euro-American settlers as well. Not to mention what took place in the southern cone of Africa, in what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where you had the spectacle of thousands of U.S. mercenaries flocking to fight and oftentimes lay down their lives on behalf of a racist regime, not to mention the settler state of apartheid South Africa, of Namibia, etc. So yes, you are correct to point out that this was an intensely bloody and painful and hurtful struggle. The lessons to be drawn, I think, include what you probably already know, which is international solidarity. That is to say, France found itself increasingly isolated. I've already made a reference to Nasser's Egypt and Nasser's Egypt's support for the liberation struggle, the contradictions that it led to between Paris and Washington, because in an opportunistic sense, Washington was seeking to steal a march against France. Because keep in mind that the way colonialism worked, generally speaking, is that it locked in the colonized nations and territories into a kind of exclusive relationship with the colonizing power, making it difficult for U.S. capital to penetrate. So there was a kind of pragmatism involved in Washington seeking to undermine French colonialism in Algeria. Now, sadly, as oftentimes is the case, many of our friends on the left assumed that Washington was acting in good faith. This was an example of anti-colonialism and, in fact, progressivism, when actually it was an attempt to elbow France aside so that Washington or U.S. entities could grab Algerian natural gas, for example, in particular, which was the real prize concerning this liberation movement. So that's a brief summary in response to your intelligent question.
But I really did want to get in. You mentioned South Africa for a brief moment. I'm
Peter,
quite curious.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. You were you were muted. I muted you because I heard you typing. But can you please start over? Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to shift down south for a little bit. You mentioned South Africa briefly, but something that's come up in a lot of conversations of late is the question of why the rest of the world outside of the U.S. and its European vassals haven't imposed economic sanctions on the Israeli government to bring an end to the genocide. And one of the reasons is that under the UN Charter, unilateral sanctions or any sanctions that are imposed outside of the UN Security Council are prohibited, and states that aren't as powerful as the US want to retain that aspect of international law by following it through their state practice. But then you have the example that is often brought up of a successful sanctioning campaign, and that would be apartheid South Africa. Could you give our listeners a bit of a background on, first of all, to what extent that sanctioning campaign was successful, and also whether that was a government to government or intergovernment operation, or if it was really led by civil society and governments didn't actually impose de jure sanctions on South Africa?
Well, with regard to South Africa, you are correct to suggest that unilaterally imposed sanctions are generally not accepted globally under international law. That's one of the reasons why India and China are ignoring the EU and US sanctions on Russia, which of course has led to this countermaneuver by Washington, at least with regard to India, to heighten sanctions against New Delhi. South Africa was different for a number of reasons. Number one, there had been a determination in the international community, not least at the United Nations, that apartheid was a crime against humanity that it was a threat to international peace and security. There was a vibrant movement in the United States that caused even the Reagan administration in the 1980s to eventually have to bow to civil society's demand that sanctions be imposed on apartheid. I mean, remarkably, the United States preceded a number of Scandinavian countries in putting sanctions on apartheid South Africa, which is quite extraordinary in retrospect, because these nations are generally to the left, to put it mildly, of the United States of America. But the key element was a mass movement that was able to break through, in the US Congress, was able to break through in the media, the universities, just like you had these encampments on campuses in the United States about Palestine in the last 20 odd months since October 2023. You had similar encampments in the 1980s concerning apartheid. Now, the difference is there's been this counter-revolutionary maneuver since October 2023. You see under Mr. Trump that universities are being battered from pillar to post. They're expelling students. Their border agents are acting in a very roughhouse manner and dragging Turkish and Palestinian students off the streets and detaining them, oftentimes indefinitely. And I think it bespeaks the fact that to this point, the movement with regard to Palestinian solidarity has not attained the strength of the anti-apartheid movement. And also, the objective condition has changed, because I think with the advent of the Trump administration, you have the stench of neo-fascism in the air, despite the fact that there were some who were suggesting that Reagan represented a similar destiny. Retrospectively, that was not necessarily the case, for example. And I think that our job right now, obviously, is to strengthen that movement here in the United States. Because let's face it, the United States is the major stumbling block with regard to progress on the Palestinian question. Of course, we can critique the recent diplomatic maneuvering of France and Britain and Canada with regard to their qualified endorsement of Palestinian statehood. But recall that after Canada moved a few days ago to put its imprimatur on a qualified Palestinian statehood, and I won't get into all the qualifications because you'll see that it doesn't necessarily amount to as much as you might think. But whatever the case, Mr. Trump decided to increase tariffs on Canada, for example, which is a shot over the bow at other countries who might be willing to act similarly, and is also an indication of the overriding point that U.S. imperialism is the major stumbling block. Now, fortunately, as a result of this struggle, we see more enlightenment concerning why this might be the case. There's been more talk about settler colonialism in North America, particularly in the United States, in recent months because of the invocation of settler colonialism in historic Palestine. And that is a step forward, politically and historically, with regard to our analysis of the United States of America. And given that positive repercussion, I think that it bodes well for our ability to make progress in terms of this struggle concerning Palestine. But it won't be easy because, as you know, the Zionist billionaires have considerable influence in this country, in the two major political parties, the Democrats and Republicans. There was considerable support on Wall Street and the corporate sector concerning apartheid. but nothing really akin to these Zionist billionaires who not only are willing to throw money around and throw their weight around, but then they have this intense personal identification with Zionism, with Jewish ultranationalism, for example, which also then differentiates it from the situation in Southern Africa.
So just a quick follow-up question on that. So in the US, at least, you had civil society first engaging in their own kind of private boycotts and then successfully putting pressure on the government to impose actual sanctions. Was that generally the story in many countries around the world? That civil society was actually able to get their own governments to impose economic sanctions on South Africa? Or was it much more of a patchwork elsewhere around the world where in some countries it would just be a boycott of varying levels of effectiveness, and then in other countries you had civil society strong enough to actually force their governments into applying direct government to government sanctions?
Well, it was a patchwork, but that's not necessarily a demerit. It's like an orchestra. You have many different instruments, and in certain movements, the violins, the conductor may call for emphasis of violins and tell the brass section to cool it. And sometimes it's the other way around. I mean, for example, in the United States, civil society, as you put it, speaking of student movements, labor movements, Black movements, were putting pressure on municipalities, for example, on cities, on states, on universities to divest their endowments from investments in corporations that had holdings in South Africa. You had all of these localized, if you like, movements that then culminates in federal sanctions and national sanctions from Washington. The Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act passed over Reagan's veto in the 1980s, for example. Not only passed over Reagan's veto, but with a number of his comrades in the Republican Party breaking ranks and supporting the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. And so, given the strength of the movement in the United States, which is noted in many ways was in advance of many of its North Atlantic allies, many of its Asian allies, that gave this movement extraordinary strength and extraordinary influence.
So I wanted to jump back to something when we were discussing Algeria and history, and you often emphasize how important it is for leftism and anti-imperialist activism today to learn and understand our history, and that lack of knowledge, you could say, maybe even translates into an ineffectiveness today when it comes to our anti-imperialist struggle. Now, you say that, for example, Algeria had a very good relationship back in the day with black activism. Think about Ben Bella, contact with Martin Luther King, etc., hosting the Black Panthers. In other words, if we would know this kind of stuff, it would also, for example, counteract the kind of successful divide and conquer that is being done by US imperialism, also in the online media space. To give you an example, I increasingly encounter, for example, even among our own subscribers, black American activists saying things like, those Arabs are not going to guilt trip us into helping them because those Arabs wouldn't help us too. Arabs don't care about black people, etc., etc., etc. And when you think about the role that Algeria played and the tight connection between black activists and the Algerians, I think that activists today would have a much more nuanced understanding between the idea of black people versus Arabs, etc., etc. Have you noticed that too? That there is this kind of successful divide and conquer going on among segments of activists today?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, first of all, in the United States, with U.S. imperialism having its finger in so many pies, which puts a tremendous obligation upon progressive forces, radical forces, which are hardly the majority, to be up to speed on struggles with regard to Brazil. Mr. Trump just tightening tariffs against Brazil because the Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro, is under indictment because of trying to overthrow the government after losing an election, or an embargo against socialist Cuba because it's 90 miles from the U.S. shores and refuses to bend the knee. Now Canada is being threatened with regard to being the 51st state. I mean, I could go around the world and talk about struggles where U.S. activists have to be informed and intelligent, and sometimes they're overwhelmed. And this is taking place in the context of a right-wing society, a settler regime that's hardly recognized as a settler regime, even by people who consider themselves to be revolutionary. I mean, just to connect this to Algeria for a second, of course, during the height of the conflict, and this led to attempts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle after he returned to power and wanted to settle the conflict. And there were settler revolts in Algeria, attempts to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. Settler revolts, as I pointed out, that were not dissimilar to the settler revolt that led to the creation of the United States of America in 1776. So you had a successful settler revolt in North America leading the United States. And of course, history tends to smile upon you when you are victorious. And so now that's been interpreted as this great leap forward for humanity. Of course, if they had lost, like their comrades in Algeria, that would not have been the case. So in this environment, it's oftentimes difficult, even for people who are persecuted and oppressed, to see clearly. And then, of course, there are the complications of living in the United States of America, this white supremacy, which we oftentimes make reference to. And I think what happens is that you have this complication where you have Egyptians who are viewed as white, for example, in the United States of America. I mean, as a matter of fact, a woman who might be considered the first lady of Pennsylvania, Dina Habib, or as she is known, Dina Powell McCormick, is of Egyptian ancestry, married to a billionaire senator, Senator David McCormick, for example. Particularly if they're Christians, they can enter the hallowed halls of whiteness, for example, and then mimic the white supremacists, which then beclouds the understanding of many Black Americans. I mean, if you look at Queen Noor of Jordan, who was the widow of King Hussein, the former Lisa Halaby, for example, went to Princeton University, for example. Her father was the head of Pan American Airways, now defunct, for example. If you look at this popular chat show on television in the United States, the co-host, until recently, a close comrade of the daughter of George W. Bush, speaking of Jenna Bush, Hoda, Hoda Kotb. She is viewed as white, for example. Not that progressive, to put it mildly. And so you have all these complexities that oftentimes make it difficult for people to see clearly. But I would like to think that even that barrier is being surmounted because of the tireless labor of many on the Black left in particular. I would now like to give a particular shout out to Black Alliance for Peace, which In the interest of full disclosure, I've done a lot of work with them over the years, and they're doing tremendous labor on so many different fronts. For example, on the Palestinian front, the Ukraine front, etc. And it's because of organizations like BAP that I'm confident that these problems which you have elucidated will be swept from the center stage of history. And perhaps I should go on in this vein, because I was listening to a report the other day about the role of Egypt, al-Sisi's Egypt, which has not necessarily been as progressive concerning the Palestinian question as many of us would have hoped. We also see that the Gulf monarchs, particularly the UAE, they're playing a devastating role in Africa, in particular, not least in the Sudan, where the latest news is that the UAE is now sponsoring Colombian mercenaries in the Sudan, which is something we need to focus on, because Colombian mercenaries were also involved a few years ago in the assassination of the last president of Haiti, for example. And the country has been on a downward spiral since that assassination a few years ago. And I think that as well, when you get into the complexities of Arab history, you see that Egypt in particular has been a kind of junior partner of colonialism. Recall the so-called Anglo-Egyptian condominium initiated in the 1890s that was ruling Sudan up until Sudan's independence in the 1950s, which of course takes place at the same time as Moroccan independence. Recall that it was Egypt in the 1860s that launched an invasion of Ethiopia in league, believe it or not, with soldiers who had just fought to preserve slavery in the United States of America, were defeated, and then were hired by Cairo to spearhead an invasion of Ethiopia, for example. And then if you fast forward to today, you see that Egypt has been making noises about blowing up the Grand Renaissance Dam built by Ethiopia because it says that it threatens Egypt's lifeblood, speaking of the Nile River. We see that there has been an attempt by Cairo to put further pressure on Ethiopia by liaising or aligning with Mogadishu, with Somalia. I find it curious that Turkey also has a close relationship with the regime in Mogadishu, involved in everything from airport security to picking up the garbage. And at the same time, General al-Sisi has been in and out of Ankara quite a bit lately. It raises eyebrows, if not suspicions. And so as you go around the continent of Africa, you begin to espy these contradictions and complexities that also shed light upon the question that you raised.
Yeah, talking about the infection of white supremacy everywhere. When you talk about that lady Hoda Kotb or any other Arabs that are classified as white in the West, it shows that I keep repeating it. It shows that absolute rot. The absolute rot of white supremacy and racism, what it does to human beings. Like, it's at the same time, it's a terrible virus that infects almost all minds, and at the same time, it's one hell of a drug, it seems, because those who are allowed into the hollowed halls of whiteness, often that is so attractive, even though they are losing their their individuality. You could say they're losing their cultural heritage. It's the same among Europeans. There were so many different cultures were lumped together, and suddenly they were white, and they really lost their cultural diversity in a way. But it seems to be such a hell of a drug that people are willing to throw that off to just be part of the privileged group, and it seems to be such a horrible psychological effect, because you also see it in West Asia itself. You also see it in the Arab world itself, in the sense that I remember, like maybe 10 years ago, just seeing online debates among some Arabs in West Asia, and also things like, oh yeah, the darker Arabs are not as liberal and advanced as the lighter Arabs. These kind of stupid talks, like. Now, that sounds very, very simplistic and stupid, and you think, these are just dumb people who say these things. But you don't realize how unconsciously it infects everywhere, Like, even among Arabs themselves, you see that the more European-looking, nascent European-looking ones are looking down on those who are more, look more like Africans, or are more brown. It's just at the same time, it fascinates me and it horrifies me, and that's why I have such an obsession with racism and white supremacy. It's really, 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 it's such an uphill battle against this psychological rot of racism, white supremacy. That was more of a statement instead of a question. But maybe any of you has any thoughts on this.
But Gerald brought up Colombia a second ago. I mean, you have something very similar there in the power structure and the brutal violence from the upper class versus the rest. That's similar. But you made me think of that because Gerald, you brought up Colombian mercenaries in Haiti. They were also sent to Yemen for the Saudi, UAE, British, US war on Yemen. And somebody pointed out, I forget who it was, but they said, it's such a shame that Colombia is famous for exporting mercenaries around the world, while Cuba is famous for exporting doctors around the world.
Well, obviously, we're going to have to get a handle on our South American neighbor. And unfortunately, President Petro, who has been rather forthright, by the way, on the Palestinian question, as you may know, along with a number of his comrades in our southern neighbor in South America. But he's under a very tremendous pressure. And his conservative predecessor, speaking of Alvaro Uribe, was just convicted for various misdeeds. Although instead of going to prison, he's going to be under house arrest for a number of years. I guess that's one of the perks or privileges of being a former president. But in any case, that's going to intensify tensions in Bogota. And interestingly enough, although it's not very well known, Colombia also has a substantial population of African descent. You may recall that during the bad old days of slavery, Cartagena was a major port where enslaved Africans were arriving. And in fact, just like in the United States, you had these spots where the formerly enslaved had escaped and created their own communities. You had similar spots like that in Brazil, Palmares, for example, where the Africans had escaped and created their own communities for decades on end. You had the same thing in Colombia, for example. And so because of that militant history, I'm confident that we'll be able to rein in these mercenaries. I'm confident that we'll be able to bolster the progressive sentiments of the Petro regime in Bogota, but certainly it will not be easy.
So what explains? And I don't know if you have any answer to that, but what explains, do you think, Colombia's stance on Palestine? Because Colombia is pretty unique in that sense, even globally. What explains that?
Well, I think, as noted, you can refer to demography, the fact that it has a substantial black population. See, oftentimes it's not recognized by our friends on the left that the enslaved population can also be viewed historically as unpaid sector of the working class. And being the unpaid sector of the working class, they were forced into class struggle. Whereas these settler colonial projects and oftentimes these colonial projects oftentimes involve class collaboration. So I would say in the Americas in particular, you've had this historical tension between class struggle and class collaboration. In Cuba, which wields significant influence in just about every South American country and every Caribbean country, you had class struggle ultimately winning out, not least because of the heroism of the black populations in the eastern part of the island. Recall that that's where Che Guevara of Argentina and the Castro brothers had their major citadel of strength in Santiago de Cuba, which has a substantial black population, only 50 miles from Haiti, by the way, which should tell you something. And these descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class continued to carry on their tradition of class struggle. And even in the United States of America, where, as noted, you have these ideological problems, it remains the case that the black population votes most heavily against the right wing in presidential elections, for example. And as noted, you cannot explain the strength of the Southern African struggle and the anti-apartheid struggle without reference to the Black American population and their solidarity with that struggle, which gave it a particular impetus. And that's why I'm hopeful that as we scan the continent today and we begin to look at the Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, in their attempt to get more resources and revenue for their natural resources, uranium in Niger, for example, which helps to power the electricity of France, once sold for a pittance by the Niamey government, now sold at a much higher rate. In turn, this has led almost understandably to a counter-reaction whereby religious zealots are on the march. The same kinds of religious zealots who were torturing Algeria a few decades ago are now on the march throughout Africa. I think U.S. imperialism is playing a dangerous game right now in league with their comrades in the Gulf monarchs, because on the one hand, I think what the Gulf monarchs, they tend to do, they tend to export religious extremism and religious zealotry because they feel that it takes the heat off of them in their own home, in their own backyard. But at the same time, this religious zealotry can be like a raging fire that spirals out of control and that ultimately can leap the Red Sea back to the Gulf monarch. And ditto for U.S. imperialism, because this religious zealotry is not only beleaguering the Sahel states, it's also beleaguering northern Nigeria, Nigeria being the most populous country on the African continent, a major oil producer. It's beleaguering Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, where the leader, President Ouattara, has decided to run for another term, which is putatively violative of the constitution of that West African state. We see that in Senegal, which just mimicked the Sahel states in asking French troops to depart forthwith, we see as well that there are signs of religious zealotry taking place in that West African state as well. So if I were to look at the African continent from 30,000 feet, What I would say is that a major challenge is fighting this de facto alliance between the imperialist camp and the religious zealots and the Gulf monarchs. And contrastingly, a more optimistic note can be seen from the Sahel states, their relationship with Russia and China in particular. China, as you know, has just moved to remove all tariffs with regard to exports from Africa into that Asian giant. For example, China has just decided to refurbish the 1,500-mile long railway from Zambia to Tanzania on the Indian Ocean coast, which was built decades ago but has fallen into disrepair, but they're now about to refurbish it. And of course, it will allow Zambian copper to be exported across the Indian Ocean and into China. And in fact, it's also led directly to the United States, trying to build and finance a railway from Zambia through Angola to the Atlantic coast so that that same copper can go to Western Europe and the United States. But that's the kind of competitive pressure that China has placed upon the North Atlantic camp. They feel they have to mimic China, although I don't think that ultimately they will be able to do so as hard as they might try. I mean, recall when Vice President Kamala Harris, then Vice President, visited Africa, every airport that she landed in, be it Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, was either designed or paid for by Chinese interests, for example. And so she was a beneficiary of Chinese largesse, for example, which is a dynamic that U.S. imperialism will find difficult to avoid.
Yeah, somebody joked, if you want an airport to be built, call the Chinese. If you want a lecture, call the Americans.
Or if you want an airport to be destroyed, yeah. But so just to finalize, as we're already almost at the hour, Professor Horne, I think you say something very important about the Gulf kingdoms and their role in U.S. imperialism, and also and therefore also in Africa. I'm glad to see among people in West Asia, among the independent media sphere, the kind of resistance sphere and activist sphere, that increasingly voices are also saying that the West Asian resistance should aim their arrows more on the Gulf kingdoms themselves, because they seem to be very comfortable for a long time. Like people are fighting the foot soldiers, extremists and religious zealots, and defending against Israel and the United States. But somehow these Gulf kingdoms are so comfortable, and the resistance over there really should start with the first domino blocks. And that is those leaders in these Gulf kingdoms. And I've heard more stories about that, more voices saying that. So I think that's a positive development. And also about when we were talking about black activism and the kind of schism that you see sometimes between, for example, different groups, like, why would we help the Arabs, or Arabs who identify as white, and why that they don't identify with Africans, for example. But it's we there are also positive stories, I would say, and one example is, and I say positive, but it's also a very negative story. But we had, of course, we talked about that whole class struggle that is rooted in the unpaid sector of the working class, formerly enslaved black people, for example. And we where that all comes together is, for example, somebody like Chris Smalls. Chris Smalls was an unionizer and really a class struggle guy who recently tried to get food into Palestine, and of course was abducted by the Israeli government, Israeli regime, and indeed, as the only black guy, was tortured. I mean, it all comes together: the class struggle, anti-imperialism, white supremacy. And people will say, "Well, Jews are not white." No, but white people are also not white. It's a social construction, and they are included into the white empire, is what I always say. And so Chris Smalls, I would say, is an example of that kind of anti-imperialist struggle across group boundaries, and that makes me very hopeful. What are your final thoughts on that?
Well, sure. I mean, and of course, to put a finer point on it, he helped to organize Amazon warehouse workers. That is, Amazon being this gigantic online shopping mall controlled by Jeff Bezos, who also controls the Washington Post, for example, one of the richest men on planet Earth. And they've been resisting these unionizing efforts with every muscle in their bodies. And I should also say that with regards to this point that you referenced, I think that I would like to think these few Black people, a minority, who are disparaging the Palestinian cause. As a person who has spent most of my life in the United States, I'm very familiar with how that sort of trend arises. And I think that it arises because there are those who realize what justice means. There are those who realize that the Palestinians are on the correct side of history. But they also realize that a heavy price can be paid if you challenge U.S. imperialism. I mean, they will imprison you, they will shoot you, they will torture you. So this leads to a kind of dissonance, where on the one hand, you recognize what is the proper thing to do, but on the other hand, you don't want to be treated to a sledgehammer kind of attack. So therefore, you look for rationales and excuses to escape doing what you know is the proper thing to do. And so you default to disparaging the people who are being oppressed and persecuted. If there is any silver lining in that cloud, it is that, as I've just articulated, there is a deep-seated understanding of what is the correct thing to do. But that deep-seated understanding is overwritten by fear. And it's up to people like myself, people like yourselves, to strip away the fear, to organize relentlessly, and help to bring even those who seem to be wobbly into the front ranks of the struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well
Absolutely.
said.
Very well said. Thank you for that nice outro, I would say. We're now at the hour. This was super interesting. I still have many more questions popping up, but we can do that in the future. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Horne.
Good luck to you.
Thank you.
And see you next time.
Mm-hmm.
See you.
Bye-bye.
حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي انا حبيت القمر طلع القمر اصطناعي شميت الورد طلع الورد بلاستيكي تكتيكي تكتكتيكي